How's it going, everyone? My name is Miles and this is the Make with Miles channel, and today I'm going to be showing you how I made this Japanese Kumiko panel as a complete beginner. Let's go. I started this build by cutting to length some 1/2 inch thick maple, which will make up our Kumiko strips. Next, it was time to start cutting the strips on the table saw. I set the fence to just a little over 1/8 of an inch away from the blade, so that I'll have some room to sand off the saw marks later. In the end, these strips need to be exactly 1/8 of an inch or the same thickness as your table saw blade, so the joints of the grid work will nest tightly together. After I'd cut all the 1/8 inch strips on the table saw, it was time to start cutting the joints which will make up this grid work. This is the sled that I'm going to be using. These two reference guides are what we're going to be lining the strips up against when we're making our cuts. They're just attached to the base of the sled at a 60-degree angle from where the blade is going to be. As you can see, there are two reference keys both at the front and the back of the sled, and these are what are going to help us align the strips so each cut is evenly spaced. This distance between the key and where the blade cuts will define how large or small the triangles in the grid will be. There are two types of strips necessary to create this grid work. To make it easier for you to understand what I'm talking about, let's call one strip strip A and the other strip B. I started out by cutting strip A, which I only used the back end of the sled for. I made sure to keep the strip pushed up as tight as I could against the key. This is very important if you want your strips to line up easily. For strip A, the blade height needs to be set to 1/3 the height of the strip itself. I would first cut one side of the strip and then flip it over and cut the other side. It was now time to make the other type of strips. For strip B, the blade height needs to be set to 2/3 the height of the strip. I started by making my cuts on the back reference edge of the jig, and then I moved the strip to the front edge and made those same cuts but using the opposite angle. This is by far the trickiest strip to make because the cuts need to line up perfectly in the center of the strip and create a point, otherwise it won't fit together when we're assembling the grid. This definitely took some troubleshooting, first of all making sure the angle of the sled is spot on, as well as adjusting the key position slightly. After I'd cut all my Kumiko strips, I gave them a light sand with 220 grit on both sides to remove some of the saw marks from the table saw. Now that the strips were cleaned up a bit, it was time to start the dry fit. As you can see, the pieces fit snugly together. These first two directions of strips that I'm assembling consist half of type A and half of type B. Now that I knew they fit well together, it was time to actually glue each joint. You only really need a tiny dab of wood glue at each joint. I made sure to go very light on the glue so as to prevent any squeeze out, which would be difficult to clean up later. After I'd glued and assembled the initial grid, it was time to add the final direction of strips. These final strips I'm adding are all strip B, and this is by far the most difficult part of the glue up. The joints were so tight that I actually needed a hammer to persuade the pieces into place. I didn't want to dent or crack the strips in any way, so I started with a rubber mallet, but I quickly found that a regular hammer and a piece of scrap wood worked much better because it evened out the surface area. Adding these final pieces actually created a slight bow in the panel, but it ended up flattening out when I added the rest of the infill pieces later on. Speaking of the infill pieces, it was now time to rough cut some on the table saw. I first found the general length that the infill pieces would need to be, making sure to round up by 1/8 of an inch or so. I then temporarily glued a stop block to my small parts sled and began cutting. I found that taping all the strips together and just cutting them on my regular sled was more efficient and safer, so that's how I did the rest of the pieces. These are the two Kumiko jigs that I'm going to be using to hand cut the angles of each infill piece. One jig is cut at 60 degrees and the other is cut at 30. These jigs are super simple to make. There's just a slot down the middle where a stop block can slide freely, as well as a thumb screw which can lock it in place. Now that we're familiar with the jigs, let's get to cutting. I set the stop block so that only one end of the pieces are sticking beyond the edge of the jig, and then I started cutting. After cutting one side of the piece, I would flip it over and repeat the process. For this type of infill, one end of the piece is cut at 60 degrees and the opposing end is cut at 30. I probably should have chosen a softer wood, but after giving my chisel a good sharpen, it proved a little bit less difficult to cut through the maple. As you can see, I'm using a tiny piece of scrap wood to wedge the piece I'm working on up against the jig, which makes it a lot easier and safer than trying to hold it by hand. I ended up dry fitting all of the infill pieces because every piece was somewhat custom made. Once I had all the infill pieces cut and fitted, I began the process of gluing it all together. Because I had the entire grid clamped to my table while gluing in the infill, I was pleasantly surprised to see that the previous bowing of the panel had disappeared almost completely. Now that I was done with the long and tedious process of gluing, I was able to give it a final sand and even out the surface of the Kumiko panel. And with that, this part of the build was complete. Now, you're probably all wondering why I left the edges uncut and why I didn't finish this off with some sort of frame. As a matter of fact, this is only a small portion of my next build, which I'm super excited to show you guys. So if you want to see what I use this Kumiko panel for, definitely hit that subscribe button as well as the bell icon so you don't miss my next video. If you want to try making Kumiko yourself, I would highly recommend checking out Johnny Trambocus' videos over at JT Woodworks, as well as Mike Farrington's, both of which helped me immensely in learning how to make my first Kumiko panel. I've added a link to both of their channels in the description if you want to go check that out. If you liked this video, I would really appreciate it if you hit the thumbs up button, and if you want to further support what I do, sharing this video would be super helpful. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.